Formerly a top investment banker, he has made a successful ascension into the political arena. As Prime Minister of New Zealand, he aims at forging closer trade ties with China and further exploring this huge market. Join us this week as Ray Cheng-gang sits down with John Key, only on Biz Talk. This April, supermarkets across the UK started to limit customers' purchases of baby formula. This comes amid rising concerns of supply shortages in the local market. The move came after similar policies were adopted by retailers in New Zealand, Germany, the US, the Netherlands, and Australia. The rationale was seen as targeting the so-called unofficial exports to China, in which traders purchase in bulk baby milk formula and resell it back in the country at several times the initial price. The rampant rise of these private exports is attributed to Chinese consumers' surging demand for milk powder over the recent years. Numerous scandals over tainted baby milk formulas have shocked the nation and took a devastating toll on consumer confidence in local Chinese producers. However, China's official quota for formula imports from New Zealand is far lag behind the pace of the increasing local demand. Earlier this year, Chinese importers used up their full-year quota within a time span of just 2 months. That highlights the market's thirst for foreign brands, as well as a huge lack of supply in the domestic market.
We saw in about 2007, 2006, dairy prices doubled in a very short time, and that was basically due to China entering the world dairy market and starting to import dairy products from the rest of the world. And globally, consumption of milk is growing twice as fast as production.
New Zealand, while still there is potential for growth, absolutely, is not sufficient to provide the production that's needed to meet massively growing consumption.
Making things worse, North Island, New Zealand's major milk production area, is suffering the worst drought in 70 years.
It's down, at least, just about 50%.
The decreasing production has pushed up the prices of dairy goods. According to New Zealand's Fonterra Cooperative Group, which accounts for 40% of the global dairy trade, formula prices soared by nearly 20% in May. Analysts expect the upward trend to continue. The drought has led to a drop in output and an oversized demand growth from China, which is putting further strain on the supply side. As Prime Minister of New Zealand, the world's top dairy maker, what is John Key's view on this imbalance?
Mr. Prime Minister, it's a privilege having you with us.
Thank you very much for having us on the show.
What's been making news in China lately is the fact that a few governments chose to impose a certain quota on the amount of milk powder one can purchase for babies.
Okay.
What do you make of that?
From New Zealand's point of view, we want to move increasingly into infant baby formula because it's more valuable than straight milk powder. And so that requires two things. I mean, the processing plants are different. And the second thing is the development of the brand. I mean, ultimately, that can be very expensive in China. Quality of the product. So, I mean, if there was a perception that was not being used for domestic use, but somehow being repackaged as a commercial matter, then New Zealand would care about that because it highly preserves the brand and the integrity of that brand. And we need Chinese consumers to know that when they get a product that has been supplied from New Zealand, that it stands for quality, and that would be a scrutiny from any analysis. So if there is any concern that was being interrupted with, then New Zealand would care deeply about that. But if it's just, I'm buying some cans of infant baby formula because I want to take them back for my child, then we wouldn't care about that.
We understand you are spending quite a few days in China. What might be expected of you back in New Zealand?
We're quite happy to work with the Chinese side, continuing to work on food safety standards for the domestic producers, continuing to invest in production here on the ground in China, and build confidence for Chinese consumers. That's an issue that I know the Chinese administration think a lot about. Whereas, in fact, actually, the strength of a really good relationship is when you can understand each other's needs and respond and provide help. And I think that builds something that moves beyond a sort of political relationship to a friendship, and that's really what we're doing with China.
How's the drought situation? Does that seriously affect or damage the
we think it's in the order of kind of $1 to $2 billion, probably more. That's $2 billion in than 1 billion, so it's about 10 billion RMB. It doesn't show up all in 1 year. It's been extraordinarily dry. I mean, typically we have lots of water, and Australia has droughts. This year Australia's had sort of almost floods, and we've had droughts, so it's been very odd. But it's one of those things where very occasionally you will get that. And, if you look at the sort of farming and agricultural environment, kind of every so often you're going to get a drought or a flood or a tornado or whatever it might be, bad weather conditions. So our farmers do their best to work their way through that. Whether that is much part of a much longer term systemic change in terms of weather patterns, I wouldn't want to predict that. But in the short term anyway, we're providing as much sort of relief as we can to our farmers.
China's gross market demand for dairy products has motivated local firms to seek overseas expansion. Nicknamed the global pasture and often described as the last pure land in the world, New Zealand has turned into an attractive destination for Chinese investors. But their drive into the New Zealand market has met some local opposition. One case in point is the Chinese firm's bid for bankrupt Greyfart Farm, the country's largest family dairy business, counting 22 farms and more than 20,000 dairy cows. The company filed for bankruptcy protection in October 2009 due to improper management and an inability to repay its piling debts. On January 24, 2012, New Zealand's government gave the green light to China's Pengxin Group and its $170 million bid to acquire 16 bankrupt firms under receivership. But just 4 days later, a twist arose when the Chinese firm's rival bidder, a consortium led by investment banker Michael Fay, appealed to the High Court, requesting a judicial review of that deal.
It's a very, very bad investment for New Zealand. It doesn't stack up on any economic basis.
In February, the High Court ruled that the government should reveal the deal, putting the buy-up on hold. 2 months later, the government reapproved the bid, but under more conditions, including an additional 16 million New Zealand dollar investment.
No land transaction in the history of this country that has been so thoroughly scrutinised, criticised and publicised. I can't think that there's much more to say.
After the rival bidder's second appeal was rejected by the High Court, Pengxin Group finalized the acquisition in December 2012. But the debate around the buy-up still lingers on. Some critics warn the land sale would turn New Zealanders tenants in their own country.
As much as China and New Zealand like each other, there still might be misperceptions in New Zealand about China, and of course in China about New Zealand. So I was wondering if you have had any experiences or conversations about these misperceptions that we have for each other.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the most part, actually, both on the political side, both on the Chinese side and the New Zealand side, there's a very strong understanding of each other. And what happened in terms of, say, for instance, investment from Shanghai Pengxin into Crayford Farms in New Zealand was very closely followed by the Chinese leadership to see what would happen and whether they would be treated fairly and equally along with other investors. That was absolutely the case, but I think also noted in Beijing. It's also true that you've seen some of the big dairy companies here in China, Ili and Yashili, basically starting to invest in New Zealand and recently getting overseas investment office approval. The banks are starting to consider setting up Chinese banks in New Zealand. As time's gone on, that has been very beneficial to New Zealand, and actually it's the responsibility of the New Zealand government, I think, to continue to make the case about why this is an important relationship and what the benefits are.
There might be concerns or controversy in New Zealand about Chinese investment, particularly those from state-owned companies.
Well, there's two things really, I think. The first is that we've had foreign and have foreign investment in land in New Zealand, whether it's for residential purposes, someone buying a plot of land to enjoy We have a process through the Overseas Investment Office, who in the first instance, if you're a purchaser, you have to go through that process and get approval from them. There is the right for the government after that recommendation, well in fact it's a requirement for the government to say yes or no, but I think what's fair to say is it's unusual for the government to decline an application that's been approved by the Overseas Investment Office or the other way around. The sensitivity around land is an emotional issue more than a practical issue, because in reality people can't take land with them. But equally, we are obviously conscious of those sensitivities, and what we try and encourage is investment in areas where we think it would be, going back to the win-win, beneficial to both sides. So when, for instance, a dairy company comes into New Zealand from, say, China and produces develops a infant baby formula plant, if you think that through, that delivers jobs. It's high value. More often than not, they have very good retail distribution in China, so it's building market share, all of which is a real benefit to New Zealand. The straight sale of land probably doesn't produce that many benefits from New Zealand's point of view. And I think if the quantity became so large, then there would be real domestic pushback from New Zealand. It's not unique to China. I think it would be true anywhere. So wherever we go in the world, we try and encourage investors to look at where we think they're likely to find least resistance, and discourage them from areas where they'll have most resistance. We always have the capacity to change our law through our parliament, but that's not something at the moment we're actually seeing. And when we recently released some data about the foreign holdings of rural land in New Zealand, and it's much smaller than people say. So it's one of those issues that gets a lot of profile, but might not necessarily warrant the level of profile it gets.
When you openly say something like the sensitivity over land ownership, it is more of a emotional rather than a practical issue, because no one can take land away with him or her. When you say this in Parliament, what would the opposition respond?
We have a good rule of trying to ignore our opposition, but no, look, in reality, yes, some of them would try and engender, strong feelings of opposition to land purchases for political reasons. The thing I think that's important with our government is that we are very transparent and consistent. And it's not unique to China. It's absolutely true. In fact, the larger purchases of foreign land have actually come from Germans and I think the United States rather than actually China.
You were also here partly to promote New Zealand tourism to Chinese people, and sometimes, as you did in Shanghai and probably in Guangzhou, promoting some of the Australian exports.
We're a large exporter, and I think we're about China, a very large proportion of milk powder, particularly infant baby formula. But it's not as straightforward as that, or as narrow as that. It's increasingly meat, it's wine, it's all sorts of vegetables, fish, aquaculture, you kind of name it. So it's a very broad range in that area. So that's one clear area. Tourism, I think, has got enormous. We had 200,000 travellers come to New Zealand from China last year. It's been growing about 30% a year, every year for the last few years. New Zealand's a very small country, 4.5 million people. So a niche product in New Zealand or a niche product in China can be a bonanza sort of in New Zealand because of the relative scale.
For movie lovers and holidaymakers, New Zealand is home to the Middle Earth, the central stage where the hugely successful Lord of the Rings trilogy stories unfolded. The films are credited with spurring a tourist boom in New Zealand and turning its film industry from a virtual cottage sector into a major economic growth driver. The Wellington debut of The Hobbit, a prequel to The Lord of the Rings in late 2012, reignited a Middle-earth mania across the world. But for the oceanic country, that fever has not come easy. In September 2010, New Zealand's Actors Union called for a boycott of The Hobbit amid a dispute over pay and working conditions. In a harsh response, the movie's production company, Warner Brothers, threatened to move its $500 million investment elsewhere. As the row escalated, Key stepped in. The Prime Minister was keen to keep The Hobbit in New Zealand, as the movie was expected to generate roughly $1.5 billion in revenues for the country, nearly 2% of its annual economic output, in addition to creating thousands of new jobs. After arduous talks, the government finally reached a deal with Warner Brothers and amended the country's labor law in favor of the movie maker. It also pledged a tax reduction of 20 million New Zealand dollars and a 10 million New Zealand dollar subsidy for the blockbuster's market promotion. The decision, which came just half a year before a $30 million cut in the country's education budget, sparked fierce domestic criticism, with John Key becoming the natural target. Bowing to the immense pressure, the favorable policies got called off.
New Zealand has always been associated in China with a few blockbuster movies, and most recently The Hobbit, about what those movies truly bring to New Zealanders.
Last year we grossed about 3.3 billion New Zealand dollars from the making of movies, so that's about 15 billion yuan. There were thousands and thousands of jobs created because of the making of The Hobbits, and the promotional benefits of New Zealand are very large. So we would say the movie industry is very important to New Zealand.
And you're confident that along with the movie The Hobbit, there will be another wave of tourism?
All the advice we see supports that view, yes. So there's quite a number of people that are indicating they're coming to New Zealand because they have seen the movie and they want to visit either where it was made or that's just whet their appetite for the scenery that's on display.
Smiling Assassin. That's the nickname John Key gained when he was working as the global head of foreign exchange at Merrill Lynch in London during the late 1990s. It was a reflection of his innate cheerfulness, coupled with ruthless determination to achieve his targets. In 2001, Key quit the banking industry to start his political career. After only 5 years, he was elected chief of New Zealand's Conservative National Party. The stone got rolling since then. In the 2008 general elections, Key's party won the largest share of votes and seats in Parliament, and he became the country's prime minister. His victory ended 9 years of government dominated by the Social Democratic Labour Party, led by Helen Clark. The Smiling Assassin, as he was known as, smiled at last.
In their hundreds of thousands across the country, they have voted for change. And I can tell you, there will be a new national-led government in New Zealand.
4.5 years later, how does Key see his career transition from finance to politics? And what would be his legacy, in his view?
You were in the private sector, and you were a banker. I read the nickname Smiling Assassin in your bio as well, and you're smiling now.
Yeah, I am, yeah.
Imagine someone with your track record running for the presidency in UK or in the United States.
Right.
It will be met with a lot of bankers bashing, which is very popular around the world.
Yeah.
But obviously you've been as the Prime Minister since 2008. How would you assess the bankers' private sector versus public service scenario?
Well, in terms of jobs, they're quite different. The private sector role, certainly as an investment banker, is much more narrowly focused, so it's a profit-motivated role. I mean, you have to have corporate responsibility and all those things, but in the end, you're judged by the financial results. That's not the case when you're Prime Minister. I mean, there are many and varied things that you try and do, and in fact, actually, many of them are very difficult to measure, and they're quite subjective. Has it hurt me? Well, I don't think so, actually. I think New Zealand actually put a bit of store in electing me as Prime Minister because they wanted someone with good economic leadership at a time where the country was in recession and going into the financial crisis. Would it work overseas? I don't know. I don't think the fact that Romney came from at least similar background to mine was the reason he didn't get there. There would be lots of factors for that, but I'm not entirely convinced that was the reason. You'll always have your political opponents, and I have, and in the end, either the merits of your case or the performance you've had will be, I think, the measure that people will use whether they either elect you or re-elect you.
What would you consider to be your biggest legacy when you look back one day in the future?
Hopefully it'll be two things, really. Strong and dependable leadership at a time where the country's gone through lots of challenges. So we've obviously had the global financial crisis. We've had the major earthquakes in Christchurch. In fact, we've had everything from droughts and tornadoes to all sorts of issues that we've had to contend with. And I think through that we've been very consistent and dependable. The second thing I think is economic leadership. So we really have been trying to reform the New Zealand economy off a very efficient base, but nevertheless reform the New Zealand economy. And when people look back, it'll be for them to decide what they think of my legacy whenever that takes place. I don't worry too much about it. I really came into politics to leave New Zealand in better shape than I found it, and hopefully that will be the case when I finally go.